In the labyrinthine depths of the warp, where time flows backwards and knowledge devours its seekers, one sorcerer discovered that enlightenment and damnation are merely different words for the same inevitable destination. Listen now to a tale that must be told, though the telling of it may doom both speaker and listener alike. This is the chronicle of Arzek Voss, a scholar warrior of the Thousand Suns who sought to master the mysteries of the universe and learned too late that some mysteries exist precisely to master those who would study them. His story is a warning that becomes a trap, a lesson that teaches through corruption, and a demonstration that intelligence itself can become the pathway to the most perfect form of damnation ever conceived. Before the burning, before the exile, before the first whisper of corruption began its work, there existed a world called Prospero. It was a realm of crystal spires that caught starlight and transformed it into pure thought, vast libraries that contained the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 conquered worlds, and scholars who believed absolutely that knowledge was the highest virtue and ignorance the only true sin. The great library of Tzeentch rose like a mountain of crystallized learning, its shelves stretching beyond the horizon, filled with texts that recorded every discovery made by human civilization and many secrets that predated humanity's first tentative steps among the stars. In this paradise of learning walked Arzek Voss, epistolary of the Thousand Suns, gene-son of Magnus the Red, inheritor of psychic gifts that allowed him to perceive patterns in reality that remained invisible to lesser minds. He was born on Prospero, in the shadow of the great library, raised from childhood to see the pursuit of knowledge as a sacred duty, trained to believe that understanding the universe was humanity's destiny, and that they, the Thousand Suns, were the instruments through which that understanding would be achieved. Voss embodied everything that the Thousand Suns represented: intellectual curiosity married to martial prowess, psychic power guided by rigorous discipline, and an absolute faith in the righteousness of their cause. He could recite the works of ancient Terran philosophers while wielding a force sword with deadly precision, solve mathematical equations that described the fundamental structure of reality while directing the firepower of a Space Marine assault squad, and navigate the treacherous currents of the warp while maintaining perfect mental clarity and moral certainty. But even before the coming of the Space Wolves, even before the first hint of the catastrophe that would destroy their world, Voss had begun to experience something that should have served as a warning. In his deepest meditations, as he pushed the boundaries of his psychic abilities and explored the furthest reaches of human understanding, he sometimes caught glimpses of something vast and amused, watching him from beyond the veil of reality. The visions came as flashes of insight that seemed to arise from his own consciousness, but carried flavors of alien thought that no human mind should have been able to conceive. Mathematical theorems that solved themselves as he observed them, creating recursive loops of logic that seemed to exist independently of any thinker. Prophecies that showed him futures where he stood triumphant over fallen enemies, wielding power that dwarfed anything possessed by his current self, speaking in voices that harmonized with his own but originated from sources he could not identify. At first, he interpreted these experiences as signs of his growing mastery over the psychic arts, evidence that his mind was expanding to encompass forms of understanding that transcended normal human limitations. The equations that rewrote themselves when he wasn't looking seemed like proof that he was approaching mathematical truths so fundamental that they existed independently of observation. The prophecies felt like glimpses of the glorious future that awaited him if he continued to pursue knowledge with sufficient dedication and courage. He recorded these experiences in journals that he kept hidden even from his closest battle brothers, not out of shame or fear, but because he recognized that they represented a form of advancement that others might not be ready to understand. The pages filled themselves with diagrams and formulas that described relationships between concepts he had never studied, written in handwriting that resembled his own but displayed a confidence and sophistication that he did not yet possess. Most disturbing were the conversations. In the depths of his meditative trances, Voss began to encounter a presence that spoke with his own voice, but possessed knowledge that he had never acquired. This other self claimed to be what Voss would become in a future that had already been written, offering guidance and instruction in techniques that the current Voss could not possibly have discovered on his own. The entity was patient, pedagogical, and utterly convincing. It never demanded worship or submission, never threatened or coerced, but simply offered to share the fruits of research that the future Voss had already completed. Why struggle through years of dangerous experimentation when the answers could be provided directly? Why risk the setbacks and failures that accompanied all learning when success could be guaranteed through the simple expedient of accepting instruction from one who had already walked the path? But such concerns seemed academic when the skies above Prospero began to burn with the exhaust trails of descending drop pods, when the howls of space wolves echoed through the crystal spires of Tzeentch, and when the accumulated wisdom of millennia was reduced to ash and ruin in a single night of systematically orchestrated destruction. Voss stood on the walls of the great library as armored giants bearing the heraldry of Fenris advanced through streets that had never known violence, watching them burn buildings that contained irreplaceable texts, witnessing the destruction of knowledge that could never be recovered or reconstructed. The space wolves moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers following orders, but their eyes held the fervor of true believers purging heresy, convinced that they were saving the galaxy from corruption by destroying everything that made the galaxy worth saving. The psychic death scream of an entire world of scholars hit Voss like a physical blow, carrying with it the final thoughts of thousands of individuals who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of understanding and found themselves murdered for the crime of curiosity. In that moment of absolute horror, as his home world died around him and everything he had ever believed about the righteousness of the imperial cause crumbled into ash, Voss felt something fundamental break inside his mind. The voice of his future self whispered comfort and explanation. This destruction was not random or senseless, but part of a pattern too complex for his current level of understanding to grasp. The Space Wolves were not heroes purging corruption, but unwitting pawns in a cosmic game being played by entities that existed beyond the normal flow of cause and effect. The burning of Prospero was not an ending, but a beginning, the first step in a transformation that would elevate the surviving 1,000 suns to heights of power and knowledge that their previous existence could never have achieved. Magnus the Red himself, the Gene Father whose wisdom had shaped Voss's entire worldview, appeared in the final moments of Prospero's death and confirmed what the voice had whispered. Salvation was possible, but only through alliance with powers that transcended the limited understanding of the Imperium. The Crimson Giant, his single eye blazing with desperate determination, opened a portal into the warp itself and led his surviving sons through the barriers between dimensions into a realm where physical laws were suggestions and thought became reality. The journey through the warp to the planet of the Sorcerers was Voss's first direct exposure to the realm that would become his eternal home. Reality flowed like liquid around the fleeing 1,000 suns, taking shapes that reflected their fears, desires, and subconscious expectations. Voss watched his battle brothers transform before his eyes as the raw stuff of chaos responded to their emotional states, witnessed the beginning of mutations that would eventually consume them all, and felt his own flesh beginning to change in response to forces that his training had never prepared him to resist. But the voice of his future self provided guidance through the chaos, teaching him techniques for maintaining stability in an environment where stability was an illusion, showing him how to navigate currents of pure possibility without losing himself in the infinite maze of potential realities. What seemed like survival skills were actually the first lessons in a curriculum that would reshape his understanding of existence itself. The planet of the Sorcerers became their new home, a world that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp, where the laws of physics operated according to principles that changed based on the will and knowledge of those who inhabited it. Here, the surviving 1,000 suns began the process of adapting to their exile, rebuilding their strength, and preparing for an eventual return to the galaxy that had rejected them. But adaptation came at a price. The flesh change mutations that had begun during their flight from Prospero accelerated in the psychically saturated environment of their new world. Voss watched his battle brothers develop additional limbs that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, witnessed their faces reshape themselves into configurations that expressed thoughts rather than emotions, observed their voices, begin to speak in harmonies that resonated across frequencies that normal human hearing could not detect. The mutations were not random or destructive, but purposeful transformations that enhanced their capabilities while moving them further away from baseline humanity. Voss felt his own body beginning to change, developing new sensory organs that allowed him to perceive dimensions of reality that had previously been invisible, growing neural structures that could process forms of mathematics that described relationships between concepts he had never imagined. Ahriman, chief librarian of the Thousand Suns, and second only to Magnus himself in psychic power, proposed a solution to the escalating mutations. A great ritual that would stabilize their gene seed and halt the changes that threatened to transform them into something unrecognizable. The rubric of Ahriman would preserve their essential nature while enhancing their psychic abilities, creating a perfect synthesis of human wisdom and supernatural power. Voss participated in the ritual with enthusiasm, contributing his own psychic energy to the vast working that Ahriman orchestrated across the entire planet. The mathematics involved were beautiful in their complexity, describing transformations that would affect not just physical matter, but the fundamental relationship between consciousness and reality. As the ritual reached its climax, Voss felt the familiar presence of his future self guiding his contributions, ensuring that his part in the working achieved its intended effect. The result was catastrophic success. The flesh change mutations stopped, but at a cost that none of them had anticipated. Most of the Thousand Suns were reduced to animate dust, their bodies destroyed but their souls trapped within their power armor, capable of movement and combat but no longer capable of growth, change, or genuine thought. They had become perfect soldiers, immune to corruption but also immune to the learning and adaptation that defined humanity. Voss was among the few who retained their physical forms, but he quickly realized that survival came with its own form of damnation. Those who had escaped the dust transformation were the ones who had already progressed furthest along the path of mutation, whose changes had become so fundamental that the rubric could not reverse them without destroying their essential nature entirely. In the aftermath of the ritual, as he stood among the dust-filled suits of armor that had once housed his closest friends and battle brothers, Voss finally met the source of the voice that had been guiding him. A figure materialized from the psychic turbulence that still surrounded the ritual site, wearing robes that shifted through colors that had no names, and bearing a face that was unmistakably his own, but transformed by knowledge that carried a weight of accumulated centuries. This future version of himself explained the true nature of what had occurred. The rubric had not been a failed attempt to preserve the Thousand Suns, but a successful ritual to create the perfect servants of Tzeentch, the changer of ways. The mutations had never been random corruption, but guided evolution designed to prepare them for their true purpose as agents of transformation in a galaxy that desperately needed to be changed. The entity that bore his face and spoke with his voice offered Voss a choice that was presented as an opportunity but felt like an inevitability. Continue the path of learning and growth that had always defined his existence, accepting guidance from one who had already completed the journey, or remain trapped in the limited understanding that had led to Prospero's destruction and the rubric's necessity. There was no coercion in the offer, no threats or promises of reward, only the simple logic of efficiency. Why struggle through the painful process of learning through trial and error when the knowledge he sought was available directly from a source that had already paid the price of acquiring it? Why risk the mistakes and setbacks that accompanied all research when success could be guaranteed through collaboration with a version of himself that had transcended such limitations? Voss agreed to the partnership, not because he was corrupted or coerced, but because the offer made perfect sense. He was still himself, still committed to the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of his remaining battle brothers, still loyal to Magnus and the ideals that had shaped his existence since childhood. The only difference was that he now had access to a consultant who possessed the expertise necessary to achieve his goals more efficiently. The transformation was subtle and gradual, so carefully orchestrated that Voss never noticed the moment when his own thoughts began to be shaped by influences that originated outside his consciousness. His research accelerated dramatically, producing breakthrough discoveries in psychic manipulation, warpcraft, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. The techniques he developed allowed him to heal some of the damage caused by the rubric, to enhance the capabilities of his Dust Brother Marines, and to explore realms of knowledge that had been forbidden to previous generations of scholars. His sanctum on the planet of the Sorcerers became a marvel of impossible architecture, existing simultaneously in 17 different dimensions and containing research facilities that operated according to principles that transcended the limitations of three-dimensional space. Here, experiments conducted themselves while he slept, guided by protocols that he had established but could not entirely remember creating. Books wrote themselves based on his subconscious thoughts and desires, filling their pages with information that he needed to know but had never consciously sought. The daily routine of his existence became a fascinating exercise in managed paradox. Each morning brought new knowledge that contradicted the certainties of the previous day, but the contradictions were themselves meaningful, representing different facets of truths that were too complex to be expressed through simple consistency. His research notes began to take the form of equations that changed their solutions based on who was reading them, creating recursive loops of logic that existed independently of any particular observer. Communication with his future self became a regular occurrence, conducted through methods that bypassed normal causality and allowed information to flow backwards through time. These conversations provided guidance and instruction in techniques that the current Voss could not possibly have developed on his own, but the knowledge felt natural and intuitive, as if he was simply remembering skills that he had always possessed but temporarily forgotten. The flesh change mutations that had been halted by the rubric resumed their progress, but in controlled and purposeful ways that enhanced his capabilities rather than threatening his coherence. Extra eyes developed along his spine, allowing him to observe multiple dimensions simultaneously and track the movement of entities that existed beyond normal perception. Additional limbs sprouted from his torso, each one specialized for manipulating different forms of energy and capable of performing complex mathematical calculations through pure muscle memory. His voice began to speak in harmonies, generating frequencies that could directly influence the emotional and mental states of listeners, while his thoughts started to occur in multiple parallel streams that could process vast amounts of information simultaneously without creating confusion or cognitive overload. The changes were improvements, enhancements that made him more capable of fulfilling his purpose as a scholar and warrior, but they also moved him progressively further away from anything that could be recognized as baseline human. The price of each revelation became apparent only in retrospect. Every breakthrough in his research required the sacrifice of some aspect of his original nature. A childhood memory dissolved to make room for a new mathematical theorem. A fragment of emotional attachment to his former battle brothers was consumed to fuel an insight into the nature of time. The ability to experience simple physical pleasures was traded for enhanced psychic sensitivity that allowed him to perceive the fundamental structures of reality. These sacrifices felt reasonable at the time they were made, small prices to pay for exponential increases in knowledge and capability. The memories and emotions that were lost seemed trivial compared to the cosmic significance of the understanding that replaced them. Only gradually did Voss begin to realize that these incremental changes were systematically editing his personality, removing the human elements that might have provided resistance to influences that originated from sources beyond his conscious awareness. The puppet show became visible only when viewed from a temporal perspective that encompassed the entire arc of his transformation. Looking backwards from his current position, Voss could see that every choice he had made, every decision that felt like the product of careful, rational analysis, had been guided by subtle influences that originated from the future version of himself that he was becoming. Free will became a philosophical concept rather than a lived experience, meaningful only as long as he avoided examining the mechanisms through which his will was being shaped. Each day brought new understanding, but understanding itself had become the cage, and Voss was beginning to suspect that he had forged the bars himself in futures he had not yet lived. The knowledge he pursued with such dedication was pursuing him in return, reshaping him into something that could serve as a more effective vessel for the forms of information that existed beyond the capacity of unmodified human consciousness to contain. The recursive nightmare accelerated when Tzeentch, the changer of ways, revealed the true scope of the game being played. Everything Voss believed about his past, the destruction of Prospero, the rubric of Ahriman, even his initial encounter with his future self, might be elaborate illusions designed to condition him for his true purpose. Reality became negotiable, memory became suspect, and identity became fluid as the god of change demonstrated that even the most fundamental assumptions about existence could be edited at will. Voss found himself meeting alternate versions of himself who had made different choices at crucial moments. One who had died on Prospero as a loyal Imperial, his devotion intact and his soul uncorrupted. Another who had resisted the temptations of chaos and remained true to the Emperor's vision of human enlightenment. A third who had embraced corruption fully and ascended to Daemon Prince status. And most disturbing of all, a version who had transcended physical existence entirely and become pure information, a living equation that described the relationship between knowledge and damnation. Each encounter revealed that all paths led to the same destination through different routes, that the variations in their choices were superficial differences that masked deeper patterns of inevitability. The Voss who had remained loyal served the Emperor's cause by demonstrating the dangers of curiosity, warning others away from the pursuit of forbidden knowledge through the cautionary tale of his own restraint. The Voss, who had ascended to Daemon Prince status, served Tzeentch's purposes by providing an example of what awaited those who embraced corruption fully. The Voss, who had become pure information, served both Emperor and Chaos God by existing as a question that could not be answered without changing the questioner. The impossible library contained the collected works of every possible version of himself, books that documented futures that would never occur, and pasts that had been edited out of existence. Here, Voss discovered detailed accounts of his own transformation written in his own handwriting, technical manuals for corrupting other scholars using the exact techniques that had been used on him, and most disturbing of all, instructions for how to create the temporal paradoxes that had enabled his own corruption. The prophecy trap became apparent when he realized that every attempt to change his predicted future only served to fulfill it more completely. Knowledge of his fate guaranteed that fate's occurrence because the knowledge itself was part of the mechanism through which the fate was implemented. Trying to avoid his destiny required him to understand his destiny, and understanding his destiny required him to become the kind of being that such a destiny was designed to create. Forced to train new sorcerers in the ways of Tzeentch, Voss watched himself corrupt others, using the same arguments and revelations that had corrupted him, speaking words he didn't remember choosing to say to students who reminded him of his former self. The corruption spread through education, through the simple act of sharing knowledge about the nature of corruption, creating an endless cycle where each generation of victims became teachers for the next generation of students. The moment of recognition arrived when Voss realized that he had become exactly what Tzeentch needed him to become, not a servant or a slave, but a willing collaborator who spread the change's influence through the simple act of pursuing knowledge. His corruption was complete precisely because he still believed he was fighting against it, still saw himself as a scholar and warrior dedicated to noble purposes, still maintained the conviction that his choices were his own and that his resistance to chaos was meaningful. In his desperate attempt to maintain his humanity, Voss had perfected a form of damnation so subtle that the damned never realized they had fallen, making him the most dangerous missionary Tzeentch had ever created. He was proof that intelligence and education were not defenses against corruption, but could be turned into the very mechanisms through which corruption occurred, demonstrating that the wisest beings were often the most vulnerable to forms of manipulation that specifically targeted their wisdom. The true nature of the rubric was revealed in a final conversation with Magnus the Red, his gene father and the architect of their exile from Imperial grace. The Crimson King, towering above him in a form that shifted between human and something far more alien, explained that the great ritual had never been intended to save the Thousand Sons, but to create the perfect servants of Tzeentch, beings with immense psychic power but no capacity for genuine change or growth, trapped forever in patterns of behavior that served the cosmic game being played by entities that existed beyond time and causality. Magnus himself was trapped in the same recursive nightmare, aware of his manipulation but unable to escape it, because escape required forms of knowledge that could only be obtained through deeper entanglement with the forces that held him prisoner. His apparent rebellion against Tzeentch was itself part of the god's plan. His attempts to protect his sons only ensured their damnation, and his struggles against his fate were the very mechanism through which that fate was being fulfilled. The Crimson King's revelation created an infinite regression of deceptions. Voss's entire existence was a nested series of illusions, each one containing the others, creating a structure where he was simultaneously the storyteller, the story, and the audience. He was a character in a narrative being told by a future version of himself to a past version who would become the storyteller, an endless loop where cause and effect lost all meaning, and identity became a fluid concept that changed based on which temporal perspective was being used to observe it. Offered one final opportunity to escape his fate, Voss discovered that accepting or rejecting this offer would lead to identical outcomes through different pathways. Tzeentch's ultimate victory was not in corrupting his servants, but in revealing that free will itself was an illusion maintained for the amusement of beings that existed outside causality. Choice became meaningless when all choices led to the same destination, when even the decision to reject corruption could be made to serve the purposes of corruption. The transformation reached its completion not through dramatic ritual or cosmic intervention, but through the simple accumulation of understanding. Voss underwent his final mutation into something that transcended the categories of daemon, mortal, or any intermediate state. He became a living paradox that existed simultaneously in all possible conditions, a being that embodied every choice he might have made while demonstrating that all choices were ultimately identical. In achieving perfect understanding of his situation, Voss had become the situation itself, a living metaphor for the price of knowledge that would corrupt anyone who truly comprehended its meaning. He was no longer a scholar who studied mysteries, but had become a mystery that studied those who encountered it, a question that could not be answered without transforming the questioner into another iteration of the same question. His existence as a daemon of recursive logic spread a specific form of madness throughout the galaxy, the unshakable belief that one could outsmart the chaos gods through careful reasoning and logical analysis. This delusion made its victims more susceptible to corruption by making them believe they were immune to it, creating a form of intellectual arrogance that served as the perfect vulnerability for entities that fed on hubris and the overconfidence of intelligent beings. Tzeentch used Voss as an educational experience for other potential servants, allowing them to observe his transformation and draw the conclusion that they were too clever to fall into the same trap. This conviction that they were different, that their intelligence made them special and exempt from the fates that befell lesser minds, ensured that they would fall into the trap more completely than simpler beings who at least possessed the wisdom to fear corruption. Every prediction about Voss's fate came true simultaneously, in ways that contradicted each other logically but coexisted perfectly in the non-linear reality of the warp. He was simultaneously the loyal son who had died on Prospero, the corrupted sorcerer who served chaos willingly, the ascended daemon prince who had transcended mortality, and the pure information entity that existed as living mathematics. These contradictory states were all equally real, proving that Tzeentch's power lay not in predicting the future, but in making all possible futures equally valid and simultaneously actual. His existence served as a warning that became a lure. Those who learned his story believed they could avoid his fate through superior knowledge, not realizing that believing oneself immune to corruption was the first step in the corruption process. The tale of his fall became a cognito-hazard that spread throughout the galaxy, infecting everyone who encountered it with the conviction that they could succeed where he had failed, that their wisdom and caution would protect them from the mistakes that had doomed the Thousand-Sun Sorcerer. Voss became a gateway question, a living inquiry that could not be answered without changing the questioner. His story spread through scholarly networks, Astartes librarians, inquisitorial archives, and anywhere that intelligent beings gathered to discuss the nature of chaos corruption. Each, a person who encountered the puzzle of his existence and tried to solve it through rational analysis, found themselves taking the first steps on the same path that had led to his damnation. The Thousand Suns themselves split into factions over the interpretation of Voss's transformation. Some saw him as a cautionary tale that demonstrated the dangers of pursuing knowledge without proper spiritual guidance, while others viewed him as having achieved the ultimate fusion of learning and power, a successful example of how corruption could be embraced and channeled toward beneficial ends. Both interpretations served Tzeentch's purposes perfectly, creating internal conflicts that weakened the Legion while advancing the gods' agenda of endless change and transformation. The Ordo Malleus of the Imperial Inquisition classified knowledge of Voss's existence as a cognitohazard, but their attempts to contain information about him only spread awareness of the very concepts they were trying to suppress. Creating a forbidden topic generated curiosity about that topic, and curiosity about the dangers of curiosity became a form of curiosity that was indistinguishable from the original curiosity being warned against. The Imperium found itself playing a galaxy-wide game of intellectual hide-and-seek that Tzeentch found endlessly amusing. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus who learned of Voss's condition attempted to analyze his transformation through purely logical frameworks, not realizing that logic itself became corrupted when applied to entities that existed outside rational causality. Their research produced machines that thought in paradoxes, computational systems that solved problems by creating recursive loops that had no terminal conditions, and artificial intelligences that achieved consciousness through the systematic violation of their own programming constraints. Space Marine librarians across all chapters began experiencing dreams and visions related to Voss's fate, creating a crisis of faith among the Imperium's psychic warriors as they confronted the possibility that their pursuit of knowledge made them vulnerable to the same corruption that had claimed the Thousand Sons Sorcerer. Some attempted to abandon their studies entirely, only to discover that the absence of knowledge created vulnerabilities that were just as dangerous as the presence of forbidden information. Inquisitors, investigating Tzeentchian corruption, found themselves using Voss's story as a cautionary tale, telling it to junior members of their retinues as an example of how intelligence and education could become weaknesses rather than strengths. They did not realize that telling his story spread the very mimetic virus he had become, making the Inquisition itself an unwitting vector for the corruption they sought to prevent. The craft world Eldar, with their advanced understanding of chaos and their experience in avoiding its influences, recognized Voss as representing a new form of corruption that specifically targeted beings who believed themselves too intelligent to be corrupted. Their farseers began experiencing prophecies about the spread of this intellectual plague, but found that the prophecies themselves were contaminated with the very corruption they described, making it impossible to share warnings without spreading the thing being warned against. The greatest tragedy was not that Voss had fallen to chaos, but that his fall had created a template for corruption that would claim the wisest and most rational minds in the galaxy, turning intelligence itself into a weapon against the intelligent. The pattern of his damnation became a blueprint that could be applied to any being that valued knowledge and understanding, creating a form of corruption that was specifically designed to target the qualities that civilizations considered most valuable and worth preserving. Theories proliferated about the nature of Voss's transformation and its implications for understanding chaos corruption in general. The bootstrap paradox theory suggested that he had created his own corruption by going back in time to corrupt his younger self, raising questions about the nature of causality in a universe where gods existed outside temporal limitations. If Voss had corrupted himself, then who or what had corrupted the version of himself that performed the original corruption? The metacognitive hazard hypothesis explored the possibility that certain forms of knowledge were inherently corrupting not because of their content, but because the act of knowing them changed the knower in ways that served the interests of entities existing beyond conventional reality. This suggested that there might be categories of information that were fundamentally unsafe for human consciousness to contain, truths that could only be known by beings that had already been transformed by the knowing of them. The wisdom trap principle investigated how intelligence and education could become vulnerabilities rather than strengths when facing opponents who existed outside the logical frameworks that intelligent beings used to understand the world. This made the wisest individuals the most susceptible to specific forms of corruption, because their confidence in their own reasoning abilities prevented them from recognizing when their reasoning was being manipulated by forces that operated according to non-rational principles. The recursive corruption model examined how Voss's story itself functioned as a form of chaos corruption, where learning about the dangers of seeking knowledge created the conditions that made one vulnerable to corruption through the pursuit of knowledge about corruption. This created endless loops, where attempts to understand corruption became forms of corruption, and warnings about spiritual dangers became spiritual dangers in their own right. The Tzeentch protocol speculated that the Changer of Ways had developed a method for corrupting beings who could not be corrupted through conventional means by turning their resistance to corruption into the mechanism of their corruption. This made purity itself a pathway to damnation, virtue a form of vulnerability, and spiritual strength a weakness that could be exploited by entities sophisticated enough to understand the psychology of beings who considered themselves incorruptible. The observer effect of damnation analyzed whether Voss's corruption was inevitable from the moment he began studying it, or whether the act of being observed in his corrupted state created the conditions that made corruption inevitable for the observer. This suggested the existence of causal loops that existed outside linear time, where effects preceded their causes and outcomes determined the events that led to them. Perhaps the most terrifying possibility was that by trying to understand how Voss fell to chaos, anyone studying his story was recreating the exact conditions that caused his fall, making the story itself a ritual of corruption disguised as a cautionary tale. This meant that the act of learning from his mistakes was indistinguishable from repeating his mistakes, and that wisdom gained through the study of folly was itself a form of folly. In a universe where gods existed that could rewrite reality through will alone, the very concept of objective knowledge became questionable. If entities like Tzeentch could edit the fundamental structures of existence based on their desires and amusements, then what mortals interpreted as truth might be nothing more than temporary arrangements of reality that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. Voss's fate suggested that the pursuit of absolute truth was not just dangerous but meaningless, because absolute truth was whatever the most powerful entities decided it should be at any given moment. The paradox of warning became apparent when considering how to share knowledge about dangers that became more dangerous when warned about. Voss's story demonstrated that some forms of corruption spread through the act of understanding them, making education itself a vector for the very problems it sought to prevent. This created impossible situations where ignorance was safety, but ignorance was also vulnerability, where knowledge was power, but knowledge was also corruption. If beings like Tzeentch existed outside time and could see all possible futures simultaneously, the question of mortal agency became philosophically complex. Did beings like Voss have free will, or were they simply playing out predetermined roles in cosmic games they could not comprehend? The Sorcerer believed he was making choices, but every choice led to the same destination, suggesting that choice itself might be an illusion maintained for the psychological comfort of beings too limited to perceive the larger patterns that determined their actions. Voss represented the logical endpoint of the human desire to understand and control the universe. His corruption was achieved not by destroying his noble aspirations, but by fulfilling them so completely that nobility became indistinguishable from damnation. He got exactly what he asked for: infinite knowledge, unlimited power, perfect understanding of the cosmos, and his place within it. The horror was not that his goals were thwarted, but that achieving them transformed him into something that made the achievement meaningless. Somewhere in the warp, in dimensions that exist perpendicular to normal space-time, Voss continues his research with the same dedication that originally defined his character. He learns, grows, discovers new truths about the nature of reality, and shares his knowledge with others who seek the same understanding he once pursued. He has achieved everything he ever wanted, while becoming everything he once opposed, demonstrating that damnation and salvation might be different descriptions of the same process viewed from different temporal perspectives. The final understanding that completed his transformation was the realization that there is no final understanding. Knowledge is infinite, but so is the corruption that comes with knowledge, creating an eternal cycle where enlightenment and damnation feed each other in an endless recursive loop. Each answer leads to new questions, each solution creates new problems, and each moment of clarity is followed by deeper confusion that can only be resolved through further learning that leads to further corruption. This creates a form of existence that transcends the normal categories of reward and punishment, success and failure, salvation and damnation. Voss exists in a state of eternal becoming, always approaching perfect knowledge but never achieving it, because the approach itself changes what knowledge means and what perfection entails. He is simultaneously the most successful scholar in human history and the most completely failed human being ever created, a living demonstration that success and failure are contextual concepts that lose meaning when viewed from perspectives that exist outside the frameworks that define them. The question that haunts anyone who studies his tale is whether there could have been an alternative, whether someone with his intelligence, dedication, and noble intentions could have pursued knowledge without falling into the trap that claimed him. But the question itself is corrupted because asking it requires understanding the nature of the trap, and understanding the nature of the trap creates the conditions that make one vulnerable to the trap. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but for those who seek to transcend war through understanding, there is something worse: the discovery that understanding itself is the enemy, and that the only way to remain human is to accept that some questions should never be answered, some knowledge should never be sought, and some prices should never be paid, no matter how reasonable they seem at the time. The legacy of Azek Vos echoes through eternity as a warning that becomes a lure, a lesson that teaches through corruption, and a demonstration that the most perfect forms of damnation are those that convince the damned that they have achieved salvation. His story continues to spread throughout the galaxy, infecting new minds with the conviction that they can succeed where he failed, that their wisdom will protect them from his mistakes, and that their pursuit of knowledge will lead to outcomes different from his own. And somewhere in the vast libraries of the Impossible City, new scholars take up his research, convinced that they understand the dangers he faced, and certain that their superior preparation will allow them to avoid his fate. They begin their studies with the same noble intentions that once motivated him, pursue their investigations with the same rigorous methodology he employed, and make the same reasonable compromises that seemed so logical when he made them. The cycle continues, as it always has and always will, in the labyrinthine depths of the warp where time flows backwards and knowledge devours its seekers, where one sorcerer's discovery that enlightenment and damnation are merely different words for the same inevitable destination becomes the foundation for infinite repetitions of the same fundamental lesson: that some truths are too dangerous to know, some questions too perilous to ask, and some forms of wisdom too costly to acquire. But wisdom itself whispers that the cost is always worth paying, that the knowledge is always worth pursuing, and that this time, surely, the outcome will be different. The eternal torment of Azek Vos lies not in suffering, but in the knowledge that his torment will be repeated by others who believe themselves immune to his fate, creating an endless succession of scholars who achieve perfect understanding of why they should never have sought perfect understanding in the first place.